following is rated TV MALSV. It contains strong language, violence, and nudity. It is intended only for mature audiences.
Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome to Darkroom, where the hidden becomes known. I'm your host, Devious Dave Rose, and today is March 5th, 2019. And on this episode, we're discussing the coming wars. So before I continue on with the show, I want to mention that we will potentially be opening up the phone lines tonight, but we'll see. There's a lot of information to go through, and I want to get to that right now. Now, much of the stuff that I'm going to be discussing tonight is not being featured at all or even mentioned in any sort of mainstream media. And it's extremely important to know because in the long run, this is going to affect everyone on the planet. So the most recent news so far is that India and Pakistan are essentially yet again at the verge of conflict and war. 2 Indian fighters were shot down in the skies of Pakistan, and one pilot apparently committed suicide or was killed, and the other was captured but eventually handed over. And there's been calls from either side to utilize nuclear weapons to resolve this conflict over a border issue in regards to Kashmir, which is something that exists as a remnant of colonial times. And unfortunately, because of the tribalist mentality of individuals that live in these countries, which, if we're going to be honest, are shitholes, you understand that something as simple as a border war could lead to nuclear conflict. And unfortunately, due to certain treaties, there's a potential for it to engulf the entire region and the entire country and may in fact lead to worldwide war and nuclear aggression. So this is something that there's not much focus on right now in the media, but it is something that needs to be considered. And there's a lot of issues that are related to the India-Pakistan conflict because China, for example, is quite invested in Pakistan because they're making new deals, especially in Afghanistan as well, for the utilization of material resources, and Russia, as always, is involved in that region as well. But you have India, who is essentially supported by the West, but Pakistan the same thing. So you have India that for a long time was purchasing equipment and vehicles from the former Soviet Union and Russia, and you have Pakistan who's receiving payments, essentially bribery, but international funds for humanitarian reasons, at least officially, and that's spent on buying contracts from American manufacturers for things like the F-16 and for Sikorsky helicopters and many other things. So you have both sides feeding the conflict both with money and with equipment, and it essentially allows for an additional conflict to exist in that region to allow for distraction from any sort of domestic issues, but also to allow for some sort of attempt at hegemony in that region, to attempt to control that region, whether it be through influence, through resources, through financial means and such. And this is something that is, again, not being featured as much as it should on the media scale, just for the fact that there are international players who want to see a conflict between these two nations. I do apologize. I am taking a drink here, a sip of a drink, I should say, just because there's a lot to say, and apparently I'm getting much more dehydrated as I'm speaking. But there's a lot to say, so I will continue. Now, with this Southeastern Asian conflict that we have with Pakistan and India, we also have conflicts in China with the Uyghur region, and they are essentially waging a war against Muslim separatists in the western part of China, and they are capturing many people, including civilians, and putting them through re-education camps. They're forcing Muslim shop owners to sell pork, for example, or to eat pork. They're going very hard at a minority group, I guess, that you could consider in China. China's actually made up of many different ethnicities. That's not something that the media is going to speak to you about, but the Han Chinese, which is the dominant demographic in China, at least with power, is the one that is controlling these sorts of things, and they are attempting to initiate a genocide over the lesser powerful ethnicities that exist within China. Now, why am I saying this in regards to India and Pakistan is that China, I should say, has a lot of money, and they are invested in that region close to Kashmir. They want to have balance and security within that region, especially because there is conflict between the potential three along the border lines. They have issues in regards to Tibet, which is in somewhat close to the region, but they don't want to allow for Uyghurs, for example, to state any sort of autonomy, just like the Tibetans. They want to keep the whole area under control. And if you've got porous borders, then there's a very good chance that fighters will go in and out and utilize international law against your ability to control them. And we've seen this with Afghanistan, for example, where fighters would go back and forth through the Pakistani border to ensure that they weren't attacked by any sort of forces. And that's not just the most recent conflict in Afghanistan. It's also the conflict that happened in the early 80s with Russia in trying to control Afghanistan after the fall of their government. So China, quite astute as they are, still tries to utilize deceit to control these sorts of situations. And we have basically two third world countries, well, if we include China, three third world countries that are armed with nuclear weapons, despite the fact that the majority of their people live in absolute poverty. They have somehow, if you want to be naive about it, have been able to acquire the technology necessary to get nuclear weapons. And that is not a simple feat, even if you're utilizing industrial espionage, which is what these three powers definitively did. But you have Western countries that are essentially bribing these third world countries with this technology to allow them to develop nuclear weapons and further create conflict within these regions and allow for an opportunity for the military industrial complex, no matter where in the world, because there are many times that people concentrate on America in regards to selling arms to the world and profiting from war. But many people are not aware as to how efficient the Belgians are, for example, for promoting and selling war, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Polish, the Czechoslovakians. There are a ton of countries in Europe. Italy, for example, sells on the domestic market as well. There are a ton of countries that sell arms to any sort of third world shithole that wants to buy them, and they've got no problem doing so. And yet there's a lot of emphasis that's put on the United States, and even with Canada, for example, that they're more than willing to sell weapons to a dictatorship. But in fact, the entire world understands that war is profitable, and they don't really care who buys the product. They're just there to sell it. And Canada, for example, has been involved with selling weapons to the Saudi Arabians, and there's been a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's been a fair bit of outcry about it. But in the end, it really doesn't matter because it's just profitable. War is profitable, and even local issues, such as what we've seen with Pakistan and India, can produce a lot of contracts, a lot of employment, a lot of income generation when it comes to promoting an armed conflict. So we have that situation in Southeast Asia with China helping them out, but we also have China, for example, in the South China Sea, where they've essentially found a bunch of extremely small islands and just sandy outcrops from the sea, and they've now essentially drudged the ocean and created full-size islands with long-range aircraft landing strip bases, so they can land like heavy bombers and stuff. And when you understand the type of armaments that are being used, you just can't land a big bomber that's heavy, loaded down with weapons and fuel, onto a small island without enough runway that hasn't been built up with enough strength on that runway to allow it to land safely. So the work that the Chinese have done essentially over the last 3-4 years has been next to phenomenal, because they've installed fairly strong bases with anti-aircraft batteries, with long airstrips, with the ability to launch multiple types of attacks from those locations. So we have China now trying to extend their hegemony into the South China Sea, which they've essentially claimed is theirs without any sort of either political backing, political support in the UN, for example, or even historical proof. But they attempt to try to push that, and that builds further into what they have planned. And they have many things planned, but one thing with the South China Sea is the recapturing and repatriation of Taiwan. Well, what does that mean? They've always claimed Taiwan was a breakaway province, despite the fact that the official Chinese government fled mainland China to establish themselves in Taiwan. they claim that it's just a breakaway province and eventually they're going to come under their control. That's why the Americans, for many reasons, decided to invest with them. So they're protecting Taiwan now. And their plan is to build up such a presence in the South China Sea that they can overwhelm any attack coming from Japan, from South Korea, or sorry, I'm looking at a few things here, so I'm getting a little distracted. But basically, Taiwan as well. Yeah, Taiwan. To basically to overwhelm those forces with the way that they're projecting their power. And it's a bigger, larger geopolitical concept that many people are sort of dismissing or at least not aware of. All these supposed isolated events all relate together because it's all about influence, it's all about power, and it's all about control. So we'll see this with all these different sort of countries that are attempting to set influence through the world and control certain resources that are available on this planet. Now, before I continue, I just wanted to place this map on the video here. I've been a little slow on that, unfortunately, so I do apologize. But this map is basically of the United States military bases throughout the world, just to give you viewers an idea as to how much influence the United States has in other countries, as well as potentially how much that might cost in regards to your tax money if you're American. And it's very true that when you start to place military bases throughout the world, you will start to encircle other countries that might not support you. And with that, you may eventually see conflict. So it shouldn't be surprising to some individuals that might think, well, Russia thinks that they're being attacked by the West, when you have the United States establishing anti-missile defense along their borders, having former Soviet countries adopt a NATO position, and increase your military spending to include countermeasures towards what they've announced. And I'm not in any way defending what Russia does, but when you realize that you have a country that has nuclear weapons and they might not be able to meet with you economically in regards to your spending methods or your ability to output bases, you're going to force them into a corner, and that would be detrimental to world peace. Now, obviously, there are many individuals and organizations in this world that aren't interested in that sort of thing, but when you realize that, for example, Iran is being sort of positioned into a situation where they will be the next conflict, you start to understand that there's a little more to the story. Now, is Iran innocent? Absolutely not. There's a lot of problems with that country, but many of those problems, again, are influenced by those that supply the money. So when you get on their bad terms, they'll flip on you, and you'll end up having a country that is now a pariah when they were once a shining beacon of democracy, as they say. And that, I think, specifically speaks to Iran, where during the rule of the Shah, there was absolute democracy, and you had women that were wearing miniskirts and a lot of American music and a lot of prosperity. And as soon as the religious fanatics got into power, you saw a total change. But moving onwards, because the original intent of this video was to discuss the coming wars, we have an alignment that we're starting to see now within the world in regards to these conflicts. And they are, in fact, related because the money that backs them is big time involved. But we also have that they are geopolitically involved and connected. So we've moved, obviously, from India and Pakistan to China and the South China Sea. Excuse me. But we also have China and Australia. There is several examples where China is stating that they're more than willing to attack and invade Australian interest and Australia itself, which again is a further attempt for China to try to show their power in that region. And that inevitably would bring in the response of the Commonwealth, because there's treaties that are established that Commonwealth countries related to the Crown of England will come to each other's defense, as well as the regional defense agreements that are available. Now, China is trying to place themselves as the next world superpower. They're going to fail. They are incapable of ever reaching that sort of belief or existence. But that's something I'm going to go into on another episode. The fact is, China is attempting to supersede Russia as the predominant power of Asia. Now, obviously, the United States is not going to like that at all. And Russia, I'm sure, will feel a little pressured as well. So, as we saw in 1968, there will be inevitably a conflict between Russia and China. Now, many of you might not know that President Nixon's ambassador was approached by the Russian ambassador. Regarding a conflict in China, and that the Russians wanted to utilize nuclear weapons against them. And the United States at that point had been infiltrated enough that the globalists wanted to utilize China as the manufacturing base for the future to establish them as the new hegemony of the world. So they denied the Russians the option to utilize nuclear weapons in the response of their conflict, because they said they would get involved and would respond with nuclear weapons. So that was a turning point in history that many people are not aware of. That if that conflict had been allowed to proceed, Russia would have essentially destroyed the Chinese ruling system, and China might be part of Russia right now. It might have split off on its own. It might have actually, on its own, generated democracy and a belief to rule on its own, and separately from any sort of influence. So that's a possibility of history that we might never know about. Now, speaking of Russia, Russia has issues in Europe. We have Turkey that is attempting to become part of NATO. We have them being confronted along their borders with these anti-ballistic missile systems. And that in turn is forcing them to develop these hypersonic weapons to try to counter these sorts of acts that they consider threats. Now, just a little side note, hypersonic missiles that they're discussing and that they're supposedly developing have been functional for probably the last 20 years at least. And you'll see this a lot very much when you have these regional sort of conflicts where a country will declare that they're going to roll out technology that is far advanced than what other people have, or of their current level. And it really is just technology that they've been holding on to and utilized to sort of try to make a counter argument to any sort of influence that might come their way, or any sort of I'm not speaking properly today, but any threat, anything that they might think would challenge them. So we definitely have to recognize that coincidence, if you wish to call it that. I prefer synchronicity. That when certain conflicts are allowed to go forward, you have them pulling out tech that they haven't officially announced for a long time. Now, I will be talking about that in some future episode, I'm sure. I'm definitely going to be showing you some patents and other information that backs up what I'm saying. But now time to change the graphic, I think. But where are we heading, really? I mean, we've talked about all this regional conflict. We haven't even hit upon what's going to happen in Africa, because China's invested there big time, and they've set them up essentially for economic failure. They're investing in these countries and building all this infrastructure, and when these companies can't pay and the government can't back them up, well, they take control. So China right now is essentially trying to conquer the entire continent of Africa, specifically due to all the natural resources. China's become very polluted due to their own lack of sight. They are running out of natural resources, which basically they've totally destroyed in their attempt to gain this position as the world's manufacturer of cheap goods. So their only way right now to survive is to utilize all this money that they've essentially banked on the foreign debt. Excuse me. Now, what does that mean? They're not, when they buy American money, it's not like they're buying American debt. They're actually hedging against it. They own the debt. Okay, so people now owe them money. That's what is really not understood when it comes to ownership of American funds and such. Yes, when you're tied to a petrodollar and you've got to buy oil through American funds, yes, that can cause problems to the development and the sustainability of a country's economy. But when you start to buy debt of a country, you start to buy bonds, you start to invest in the country's industries and such, you now start to own that debt. So now you're the creditor. You're the one that people need to come to and pay whatever is decided. And that is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. So when some people think, well, why would a country, invest so much money in American debt? It's because they want to be a debtor to that country. So Japan, for example, has a lot of money that's been invested in America for a long time. China as well. The biggest debtor of America is the American people. They're the ones who've ended up paying through taxes, through bonds, through many other incentives, through cost of living increases. They're the ones who eventually are the ones that are owed the biggest amount. Now, because this is all based on fiat currency, good luck getting paid. But now let's move on to the conflict in Europe, where you've seen a massive increase in these economic migrants that have encouraged just any sort of criminal, third world savage to come in and demand some sort of welfare payment. Now, this is actually connected to what's called the Kalergi Plan. And this plan essentially was an attempt to establish a one world government utilizing the future European Union. It wasn't always the European Union, and they didn't always have the euro. But essentially it started off as a free market within the European countries. And it led to all these agreements and red tape that sort of forced these countries together in these legal decisions that the people didn't decide. But the Kalergi Plan, going back to it, was essentially to try to get Europe to open its doors to flood the countries with any sort of third world individual that might come in and purposely destroy the fabric of the social culture utilizing multiculturalism. Excuse me. Oh, pardon me. Going back to it, utilizing multiculturalism and an attempt to ethnically cleanse the previous native peoples of that region. And we saw this accelerate essentially right after World War II. Now, as you can see just from the map alone on the video here, Africa's a lot bigger than Europe. And yet, for some reason, they're trying to fill tens of millions of supposed immigrants. Essentially, they're just economic migrants that really, they're not even economic migrants. They're just sort of leeches. They just want to jump on the social nets that European countries have created to benefit from that without having to work. My apologies. I'm a little stuffed up here tonight, so if you'll just give me a second. All right. Back to the problem with opening the floodgates to third world savages. A homogenous society, as many of these supposed socialist countries of Scandinavia, as Americans and Canadians and anybody in the West have declared them, which they're not, only got to their prosperity through being a homogenous society. They established a social net welfare system that benefited the people, and those people, through the honor system, did not take advantage of that. But when you open the door to third world migration, to individuals that do not share your cultural beliefs, and they wish to see your nation destroyed and changed to the country that they supposedly fled from, then it's about time to realize that there is no benefit in diversity. That diversity is not a strength, but in fact a weakness. And the only thing that it's going to lead to is essentially destruction of a society and of a culture. Now, that is the same belief that those that think that borders have no value. And that actually brings me to the next conflict. Venezuela in Latin America. This is a country extremely rich in resources. but a country that essentially has squandered the ability to rise above its inevitable poverty. It's just not a poverty of economics, it's a poverty of mentality. You can see this in many Latin American countries, that despite the fact that they're presented with great opportunity, the tribalist mentality and ethnic culture leads inevitably to a socialist mentality that's not based on merit, but based on authority. It's a very strange thing. You'll even see it in places like Argentina, where even to this day, after more than 60 years of failure, ideas such as Peronism, the ideas and propositions put forth by Perón, a general that was basically responsible for ruining the country after it was quite rich, just goes to show that there is this inability to understand proper government rule and, more importantly, political ideologies. Inevitably, South America and Latin America always seems to gear itself towards socialism or communism, and to some extent it might be understandable, at least in regards to the disparity of poverty that might exist between those that rule and those that do not. But inevitably, those individuals that got into power were brought into power by those that did not have, that chose to put them thinking that they were their best representative. And when time and time again you see Latin American countries vote to allow for confiscation of firearms, and then inevitably you have the government coming in and committing crimes and bloodbaths, you have to ask yourself, what is the problem here? Clearly, it's not the poverty. If they continue the same mistake over and over again, there's a lot more to this. There's something within the culture that gravitates towards an autocratic, authoritarian system that declares everyone as equals, although every time it's been practiced, it does not come to fruition the way that they always claim it will. It's and the excuses are always, well, they never did it properly. No, for the last 100 years, no country has ever initiated socialism or communism properly. It's absolute ludicrousness. Communism essentially is responsible for at least 250 million people being killed. And that's a conservative number. Now, many people can't wrap their mind around that number. 250 million people. But those are the facts. And this is the same sort of ideology that's now being pushed in North America. Now, obviously, it's been pushed for quite a while here, but we're now starting to see the fruitions of these sorts of plans. So, we have individuals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushing socialism, declaring Venezuela to be a paradise, when, as we just discussed, Venezuela is become a hellhole. People have been forced to eat their own pets. And despite all the resources that they have available, it's been absolutely squandered by those that claim that socialism was so great. And yet, with no knowledge of how to run a country, they destroyed it. And the media is not talking about these sorts of topics, but we know they exist because when you start to dig, you find people through Twitter, or you might actually read the articles that are being published by dissident journalists in those countries. You start to find out what's actually happening. And in North America, what we're going to see, unfortunately, is a slide towards civil unrest and eventually civil war. Now, as much as I would wish that this would never happen, I can't snap my fingers and expect that all humans decide to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and become better people for it. But from what we're seeing right now, from the dissent that we're seeing, from the agitation that we're seeing from the media, it seems only inevitable this is the direction that we're heading in. But we've seen an agitation of the American public for a long time. Whether it be during the COINTELPRO operations of the 70s, or the harassment of independent journalists in the 80s, we've seen a push towards hiding the truth. Now, I postulate that the Second American Civil War went hot with Ruby Ridge. Now, for those that don't know, Ruby Ridge is a topic that isn't really discussed because it really highlights the tyrannical governmental situation that existed in the 90s that many people don't talk about. But essentially, there was an 11-day siege in Naples, Idaho in 92. And Randy Weaver and his family essentially were trying to resist U.S. Marshals from their attempt to sort of get on their property. And there's a lot of issues that I could go into this. I'm just going to give you the quick and dirty. But this is one example where you had an overwhelming use of force against U.S. citizens that had full right to defend themselves, that were attacked on their own property. And essentially, we have a lot of different civil suits that were awarded to the family members because it was recognized what was done was wrong. But this was just the first example of many to come that signaled the start of the Second American Civil War. And that's when it went hot. But then you had a situation like what happened in Waco, Texas, where when all the facts came out years later, it was shown that the compound itself was actually set on fire because the compound was filled with gas by the FBI and the ATF, and then they shot a grenade into it, which essentially set the whole compound on fire and exploded. And although there was many that were in the shelters there, they still essentially burned alive. So this is something that even now you can start to find videos that prove this, that these supposed fanatics or extremists or whatever you want to call them during the 90s weren't the people that you were told they were. And Waco is a big example of the disregard for human life when it came to what the government came out publicly and said as opposed to what they ended up doing. And who was in charge at that point but Janet Reno. This is something that, again, many people forget about, don't talk about, and just it just goes right into the memory hole. But Bill Clinton was in charge at this point. And we'll be going into his crimes in a future episode, I'm sure. But it's clear that even with that situation, they were trying to crush dissent. And that leads me actually to what happened in 1995, which is when Joe Biden decided to put together something called the Omnibus Counterterrorism Act of 1995. Remember your touchy Uncle Joe Biden, the guy that looks at children of any age and wants to grope them. Now, 1995, what happens around that time? Well, a few months into the year, we have the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, from the get-go, there was red flags that were raised about this incident. The building seemed to have blown in rather than blown out. It seems like many people that were supposed to be there were warned to stay away. There's a lot of information that goes towards that event that many people don't speak about. And what happened right after is that they were able to push these bills forward that would eventually become the Patriot Act. But it wouldn't have happened without what happened at Oklahoma City. Now, what many people are not aware of, and this is on record, is that there were at least 3 individuals that were filmed, including McVeigh, getting out of the vehicle prior to the explosion. 2 of those individuals were positively identified as Iraqi Special Forces operatives. And those individuals, although identified and eventually tracked down, mysteriously disappeared. Now, that's something that people need to question, because it is something that, again, nobody is speaking about, and all the evidence is there. And it leads further into the understanding that war and conflict makes money. Not just through military deals with organizations like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, but also through lobbying and the establishment of bills like the Patriot Act. So, where do we stand right now? Well, we went through 8 years of racial baiting from Barry Soetoro, a.k.a. Barack Obama. By the way, Barack Obama is not black. He's half black. Now, somebody might think, oh, well, he identifies with this race. Well, I don't give a fuck on what you think. Because the fact is, he's not black, he's not white, he's mixed. And for people to try to claim that he's the first black president, I think is very disingenuous, for one. And also is just ignoring the fact that he was put there in that position to exploit that racial disharmony that currently exists in the United States. But he made it even worse. Many people choose to ignore this. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that somebody like Barack Obama, who might, for some people, be considered a good orator, although I would question their judgment, they essentially believe anything that he would think and say. And because of that opportunity to say, I voted for somebody who claimed to be black, gives them that sort of assurance, apologies, that their choice for politician justifies the economic destruction that they will see. So I'm just reading a comment here from Chillin' with Dylan. And again, just to show you people, I'm not an individual that tries to control the narrative. I'd like to have a good discussion. But Chillin' with Dylan actually says, I live near Oklahoma, have for 35 years, and everything you're saying is false information. Okay. Well, if that's what you believe, it's obviously more than fine to do so, because, as I've always said, there's nothing wrong with having an opinion, even if you're wrong. Now, if you were the intelligent individual that I think you're trying to portray yourself as, you would at least provide some evidence to counter the statements that I've made, which I'd be more than willing to humor, and if you even want to call in, I'm more than willing to take your call. So, really, it's up to you whether or not you want to live up to your ideal and stand for what you say. And first of all, I want to say I've got a problem with the words again and like, I believe. I say that those too often in these videos. So I will try to adjust my vernacular to adjust for that. So I am at the point, as I have mentioned in previous episodes, that unless you're willing to actually come to me properly, which means with an understanding for logic reason in a proper debate, don't waste my time, especially since I could just ban your ass out of the chat, not bother. I'm not interested in an echo chamber, but if I've got to eject you, so be it. So more importantly is, if you're willing to come to me with a proper discussion, please do so in a manner that actually provides references, backup, maybe a citation of some sort, and I'm more than willing to humor and accept your information, because I'm not saying I'm always right, but I read fucking books. I read. I love to read. Chances are I'll read more in my life than most of you will read in 3 lives, 10 lives, 1,000 lives. I don't even know. I don't even care. All I know is that I'm a sponge for information. And I'm always willing to accept that I'm wrong, but I'm always willing to get that information no matter where it comes from. So, moving on. Back to the situation of America, where we've had socialists and communists infiltrate the political spectrum, from politicians to academia, even to social institutions. And what we're seeing right now with all these brain-dead, insane leftists that are attacking people on college campuses where they're just there to learn, or on a street corner where they're just passing by a protest. You're seeing essentially exactly what we saw in the 1930s in Russia. You had the youth essentially after a generation, being controlled by the cultural Marxists, and then having a mentality, just as we saw with the Cultural Revolution in China, that the youth knows more than the older people. That their idea of socialism is better than anything else that older people thought, because they're just superior and the older people need to be removed from existence. Now, the difference is that American people will not stand for this. As the Japanese emperor said during World War II, you cannot invade America. There is a rifle behind every blade of grass. So we already know that America is the most armed country in the world. They own 80% of all the firearms on the planet. Now consider this. You have these leftists that consider themselves some sort of video game character that they could end up killing 5 Nazis in 3 seconds. And you realize, though, that 80% of firearm owners in the United States are conservatives. Of those individuals, at least 60% or higher have served in the military, have served in law enforcement, or have served in a militia. They're highly trained when it comes to the use of firearms and combat. So, let's think about this. We have an economic crash in North America. The banksters decide to pull their moves. They bottom out the U.S. economy. And essentially, the U.S. dollar is worth nothing. It's found out that all the supposed gold in Fort Knox has been stolen by the international bankster system, replaced by gold-covered tungsten. You have essentially government employees that want to get paid and they can't. And you have international creditors stopping their money. So the economy bottoms out. And the only thing for the government to do is to declare martial law. Now, as the cities burn, you will find those leftists who are complaining that there weren't enough safe spaces for gay people in their university. Well, if they survive the looting and the rampages and the rapings that happen right after an economic collapse, they're not going to survive the militias and the militaries moving into the cities to restore order and peace. In fact, these SJWs are lucky if they end up as a sex slave in a harem after what is going to happen in North America if the ship doesn't get set straight. And unfortunately, it seems that we are heading in that direction. The economic systems that are in place aren't sustainable. And when you have a fiat currency that's essentially controlled by places like the City of London or Zurich, Switzerland, you understand that in the end, it's either slavery or it's war. And from what I've seen, humans refuse to accept slavery in the end, which is what's going to lead to a massive schism with people in both North America and in Europe. In Europe, for example, people have reached the point of no return. They don't want to accept the Kalergi Plan. They don't want to accept the invasion of third world savages that are raping their people and destroying their culture. And we're going to see guerrilla warfare in the street. And we're not going to see a benefit, I guess, or a victory on the side of those that utilize symmetric warfare. Because what's going to happen is the people that are aware of their environments, whether they live in the cities or in the rural areas, are going to be able to overwhelm any sort of military force, just like what was seen in Vietnam. But more importantly is that the majority of the military forces in the United States and even in Canada support patriots, support the idea of a sovereign country. Because without a sovereign country, their positions mean nothing. And more importantly, your life as a human being means nothing. So we're going to see a massive amount of civil unrest, which could lead to civil war within the North American continent, probably within the next, I would have to say, 5 to 10 years. Now, these might be mitigated by the possibility that more economic opportunities are made available. But unfortunately, when it comes to the international banking system, it's almost inevitable that we're going to see some sort of war. Because in the end, that's what's profitable. It's not peace, but to essentially create some sort of global conflict which you can fund both sides. I'm just going to take a moment here to read what people are saying in the chat. No more word from the individual who supposedly lived in Oklahoma City. Some conversations that really have nothing to do with the show. And we have actually a great comment from the Simple Superior in the chat. Proxy wars everywhere at the moment. Absolutely. And that's a great way of putting it, because they are proxy wars. After all, we have to consider that who's running it, those that are pushing that conflict, and who would better push that than those that are funding it. So that's a great point. I'm just going to go through my list of notes here that I wanted to discuss for tonight. Essentially, we've gone through most of it here. Now, there are aspects of the coming American Civil War which I would like to actually speak about in a separate video, so I'm not going to get into them in this episode. But before I go, I'm going to just go to the chat here. I'm going to ask if anyone has any prevalent questions to what I talked about in this episode, and after that I'm going to call it a night. So let's just go to the chat and see if anyone has any questions regarding tonight's episode. Again, I remind everyone, I try to give everyone a quick and dirty version tonight. There's obviously a lot that could be discussed on each of the topics that I brought up tonight, but I wanted to try to keep it a little light and also a little more open when it came to potentially taking calls or discussing certain topics and such. So well, we've been going on for an hour. I think that's enough for tonight. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to be talking about in the future. So if you want to let me know what you would like me to discuss in some future episode, just put some sort of comment in the area below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like it, give it a thumbs down. If you liked it, share it. You know, the whole spiel, as they always do. And we got one more comment from Simple Superior here. There's some talk about benevolent entities that would never allow a full-scale war. Now, that's a possibility. I'm not going to exclude it. There have been times in the past where nuclear war seemed almost inevitable, and almost by miracle, it was avoided. There's multiple instances where, despite the fact that we're primed for war, there's been these strange instances where some sort of intuition has led to somebody calling it off or not approving of a full strike. So I will give that to you, Simple Spirit. That is a good topic that we could discuss in the future. But also we have to consider the fact that I kind of think that the banksters don't want a full-scale nuclear war. They want a limited nuclear war. They want expenditures in arms and such, but it benefits them that the world does not burn. They would rather keep things safe because it just ensures that they stay in control and they also keep making money. All right, so I guess that's it for tonight. I'm probably going to make some more random videos maybe sometime this week. I don't know. There's stuff I've got to discuss. So until then, be sure to tune in next time for The Darkroom, where the hidden becomes known.